Good morning, good evening, everybody. Welcome to this conference, wherever you are in the world. I would like to welcome you in this session where we are going to discuss development and security at the Tunisia-Libya border. I would like to wish a good welcome to the representatives of the public sector, academic sector, civil society, and of course, to our own UN colleagues, agencies. I would like also to welcome our panelist, Mrs. Neila Feki, Vice President for Tunisia's National Counterterrorism Commission, Mr. Hamza Medeb, non-resident scholar for the Middle East Center Carnegie, Mr. Jean-Louis Romanet-Peroux, researcher and director of the North African Policy Initiative, and Mr. Michael Ayari, Senior Analyst for International Crisis Group Tunisia. In the context of this session, we are going to look at the multifaceted links between development and security, what we call the security development nexus. And this nexus is, they both depend from each other and reinforce each other to create peace and wealth. However, the other side of the same coin is that when one of those is not there, to re-establish the balance is a major challenge. Our distinguished panel will focus on the link of the development and the security at the Tunisia-Libya border, which presents an important, a crucial importance in preventing violent extremism in Africa and the Arabic area, and also in the dynamics in the triangle Algeria, Tunisia, Libya. The discussion will start with a presentation of the regional context with Mr. Medeb, and then we will review the national context and with Mr. Ayari and Mrs. Feki, and we will conclude with the policies which have been adopted in Tunisia to fight against that, to counter violent, extreme violence in the area. Our discussion will be based on a project implemented by the National Counterterrorism Commission in Tunisia and the strengthening of the prevention activities, the PVE activities, known under the name of the Project Tarabo, in order to guide the public policies and give some necessary elements for a constructive dialogue on the PVE in Tunisia. With that frame, I would like to give the floor to our panel for them to answer a question for champions. Is security and development, are they two sides of the same coin? And especially, is it true in the context of the Tunisia-Libya border? I would like to start with Mr. Hamza Medeb, who is a non-resident scholar for the Carnegie Middle East Center for the research on related to the economic reform, political economy of conflicts, and border insecurity across the Middle East and North Africa. He is also the author of a UNDP study on the cross-border situation with Tunisia and the area. What are the findings of your research and what it involves potentially for the agenda in terms of development and security in the area? Thank you very much, Alisa, and thank you to the organizers of this session and this panel. I think it's very important to give a context indeed, and to look at the dynamics that we observe in that area within their context in order to have a good understanding of that nexus of development and security. If we look at the Libya-Tunisia border, we know very well that historically this was a border structured by activities, cross-border activities, informal, which is counterfeit or customs fraud or that kind of illicit activities or informal activities. And therefore, we are not here facing a new phenomenon, if I may say. We're looking at structuring activities, not only for the local political and economic context, but as also structured society, because for about 2 to 3 decades, especially under Ben Ali and his regime, it is clear that those informal activities were designed as a safety valve in order to make up for the lack of public investment in the area, to make up for the need to create more and more employment, and compensate the structural gaps in terms of public finance and support from the state in these areas, border areas, but also in the internal area of the country. So therefore, we can see clearly that those informal activities which have structured the political and economy in the area cannot be taken into account without looking at the connections between the state and society and how they have constituted an important matter in the definition of the governance in this area. And I believe 2011 was an important time, the revolution in Tunisia as well as in Libya. And then we had a collapse of all the arrangements which were shaping the relationships at the border for those many decades. And from that same time, 2011, we faced tension in the area with the fragile context in Libya, with the safety issues, security issues, which were very high in Tunisia, with the assassination in 2013 and several terrorist attacks in 2014 and 15, which needed a form of securization of the borders with deployment of safety military system. And we saw the buffer zone being created, the implementation of trials and the safety security systems. And of course, all that were extremely important to implement with the border country, Libya, which was in a civil war. That was very important, but little by little, we could see what impact this had on the informal activities, which are still today structuring elements in the area. We saw how this has impacted the political economy in the area. And of course, things kept on worsening and created tensions, especially when the Western Libya conflict was exacerbated. And with COVID, this has turned into a very strong tension and a lot of discontent in the whole border area with social movements, El Kabul in the area. And we saw punctually some tensions here and there in the area. And to conclude on that point, I would like to present that contextual element in a broader context between the concentration between the center and the periphery. What I'm talking about here, the political center and administrative centers. And there is an asymmetry which can be declined over 5 different aspects, presented within 5 different aspects: the role of the state and the resources of the state in this area where the public sector is the only economic actor in the area and there is no private sector in there. So the informal economy is an important element with gateways which can be created with terrorism or illicit activities, illegal activities. We cannot deny that there are such gateways in place in that particular context where repression becomes a matter. A second aspect is the land rights. This is a fundamental issue, like in many areas in Tunisia, where collective ownership of the land, we somehow keep a tribal structure and encourage communal and communitary tensions. The idea is that we need to create legislation in order to change the situation, and it's an important point here to consider. And finally, the military aspect is another important aspect, and the necessity to accompany those efforts of for a need of security and safety. We need to make sure there is an aspect of human and social aspects which is incorporated within these interventions. So more communication with the population, and also, and of course, a lot more sharing of the information with the population, local population, the local authorities within the process of decentralization, in order to ensure that the decision is made the closest as possible from the citizen. Thank you, Hamza. Thank you for this introduction, this presentation. I would like to give the floor to Jean-Louis Romanet-Peroux, who is a researcher and advisor on international cooperation and development, and is also director of the North African Policy Initiative. He's been working with UNDP in Libya on research on local governance and extreme violence. According to you, and based on the evolution of the Libyan context, what are the drivers for the change which could have an impact of human security at the Tunisia and Libya border? Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you. I would like to address first a few points in order to illustrate the current trajectory and the persistent factors and motors. We are in the dynamic of change, but there are still some of them which remain, and I will then come back and continue explaining from what Hamza said. So yes, the conflict has stopped, but there are still a lot of divides on security and political aspect. There are some efforts which have been started in order to reconciliate. In terms of reconciliation, it's quite difficult with the army and the security forces. We have a government of national unity, but the political process is very complex for several reasons. One of the reasons for that is there is still a lot of insecurity. And just this week, there was a kidnapping at the west, and there was an attack claimed by ISIS in the south. The country remains very divided, just like it was before the conflict, with two areas of influence: the coastal route, where the front line was before. This is still closed, even after 7 months that a ceasefire was signed. There's still a lot of foreign combatants, foreign factors, about 20,000 of them from both sides. And we still have a major issue in terms of institution legitimacy with the union, national union government hasn't been elected as such, and there probably won't be any election scheduled this year. There is a recovery in terms of economy, which has been long waited for, and which starts to show some positive signs, but the government, if they cannot have the legitimacy, will struggle a lot to have their budget approved, and one will struggle to introduce those reforms so that the long-term success is achieved. So that particular framework is unfortunately the same than frozen conflicts. What it means, it's the country is divided, and there is a presence of foreign forces, and it's quite likely that the state will remain quite weak. It looks a bit like the Astana model, which was also observed in Syria. So it's not giving us many hopes for the time being, but what are the main differences between Tunisia and Libya? In terms of governance, the state is relatively strong and centralized. It's efficient in terms of security, but not very strong in terms of governance. In Libya, it's still centralized, still on paper, but by fact, the government is decentralized in Libya, and the municipalities, for most of them, have been elected twice or dealing with the current affairs. The security issues in Tunisia is quite centralized when it's decentralized in Libya, and the situation is very unstable. In terms of economy, in terms of the border at national level, there is a strong economic crisis in Tunisia, and it's even more so at local level with increased poverty. And the state is rich in Libya, but they can't really use that because they are not quite legitimate yet. And at local level, we don't have the same level of poverty that we find in Tunisia. There are alternatives to counterfeit, to smuggling, but the informal economy is relatively horizontal, open, and fluid, when it's the opposite in Tunisia, when it's more structured and more vertical. In terms of political aspects, there will be some shocks which can affect the Tunisia-Libya border. So there are the subsidies at on the Libya side for the oil and petrol sector, which will have an impact on the cost of the petrol, and which will make the cross-border traffic more profitable, and we could generate some riots and further tensions. A collapse of the petrol price within 2 to 3 years will also have a strong effect on destabilizing the area and possibly the conflict starting again in Libya. Thank you. Thank you very much for this analysis. We're now leaving Libya, and we're going to Tunisia with Mr. Michael Ayari, who is a senior analyst for International Crisis Group in Tunisia. He's doing research. In 2017, he worked with the UN system in Tunisia, and he worked on an analytical study about the factors of violent extremism in Tunisia, in order to inform the UN teams about how to approach the prevention activities. This is now being updated, and it aims to contribute to the review of the national strategy in that particular context. According to you, what will be the strategical consequences in terms of the international agenda in preventing violent extremism in Tunisia? You have the floor, Mr. Ayari. Sorry, yes, thank you very much. So quickly, the main problem that we face is about securizing and the military aspect of the borders. So indeed, we can see there is a blockage related to the wealth of the exchanges, the trade exchanges, both formal and informal, and has a lot of undesirable effects and have a direct impact on how the local population perceive the state, and accentuate their perception that they have had for some time in relation to the state, and which is the result from the trauma that they had in 1910 when the borders was created, and we have the similar dynamics that we had at the time, even though the context is different. We do still have cross-border areas which are reduced with pastoralists and farmers, with different smugglers and informal traders who have to stop their activities. But I believe the main shock was, of course, the near closure for several months due to COVID crisis of that border. And then we look at reconfiguring those networks, and we can see there is a spread of the different networks in terms of smuggling, who do have the means to go beyond the new rules which have been introduced. They have negotiation capacities with the authorities, and therefore they can trade some products, and they end up using these. There is a degree of insecurity for the traders. There is no longer, like Hamza said earlier, there was a circulation map after 1988 until 2011. There were some products which were authorized. This economy of getting by is no longer there. And we are facing rivalries and a strong army presence, a lack of coordination between the different police forces. So the informal agreement signed with one is not valid with another one, and so on, which means there is a certain level of insecurity as a result. So the consequences for that are quite clear. In pragmatic terms, we have indeed a risk that those cross-border population are struggling to communicate information. We have a territory which is quite opaque, informal, and historically speaking, on the Tunisia side, we have alliances which have to be reshaped and based on the trade opportunities. And we can have some clans because they lose their monopoly in mediation terms. They can then use these to their advantage and said, we do not want to have jihadists coming on our side. So they try to negotiate their situation as a monopoly, as an intermediary with the authorities. Finally, the main issue that we have observed within our research, there is no direct effect from between the cause and the effect. We can't say that more security measures will bring more security. I believe it's quite difficult to consider that like that, and why there are hundreds and hundreds of variables. But what is clear is that if we reproduce the same connection between the state and the citizens within those border areas, and if we replicate the historical policies and the different variations that we had in time, this is likely to create when we have a counter narrative, a radical counter narrative, and will be in different contexts in relation to jihadists. There is a clear decline in the attraction from those ideologies. And this is something that we find at a global scale apart from the Sahel area. The state won't be able to elaborate a counter narrative which will be credible and legitimate in order to reduce the attraction to those radical ideologies. But those who promote them believe they are in the continuation of the history. They kind of feed or reactivate their resistance in relation to a state, which is in the hands of an elite in the center, which is in the hand of the foreign powers. And somehow the state is taking away from them the capacity to organize themselves and don't give them anything in exchange. So in my opinion, and we will see how it goes, but the idea is that we need to get into a positive circle and try to break that circle. It's an area which is very wealthy, which is a real cross-border area. And I don't think Tunisia can still be considered as a territory from where all the danger comes. And I believe there is some hope here, and consider the fact that this is an area very dangerous, and this was under the French protectorate and then became independent. So the creation of a border, disconnecting border to protect themselves from the French Empire and the Republic. And then from the Italian forces from 1911, we are more like in that particular situation, to looking at the drivers and the shocks which could lead in the best case scenario. We would have a border which works really well. Red card, Michael. Sorry, I wanted to take advantage of the not to repeat that historical aspect and which increase the perception of the state and the bad perception of the state from the population. Sorry, Michael, we will come back to the questions later on, I hope. After we have had an overview on the regional context and the national context in Libya and Tunisia, and we see how it's interconnected between each other. We will now give the floor to Mrs. Neila Feki, who is the Vice President for the Tunisia's National Counterterrorism Commission when it was created in 2016. As such, she has contributed to the development of the Tunisian National Strategy Against Radicalization and Terrorism, and is currently involved in updating this strategy. Mrs. Feki, what are the principles adopted by the Commission in terms of prevention in Tunisia, and how do you apply them in the border area between Tunisia and Libya? You have the floor. Thank you, Elisa. Dear participants, ladies and gentlemen, in the name of the Tunisia's National Counterterrorism Commission, I would like to send my sincere thanks to the Oslo Governance Center to invite us to attend this third conference, the global conference on the subject of extremism, violent extremism and the future. It's a pleasure and an honor to present our approach, our proactive approach in terms of PVE, as we celebrate the 20th anniversary of the unanimous adoption of the resolution 1373, which is a reference at international level in terms of preventing violent extremism. Extreme violence and terrorism is a challenge for all societies. It's a human right. It's a fight. It's a fight that requires everybody to be involved. Over the last few years, we've been affected by terrorism like other countries were. The country has developed some mechanism in order to respond strongly on the field, but also in terms of legislative aspects and institutional aspects. In terms of the answer that we brought, we were able to improve the security in the country over the last few years. This response has a price, and very invaluable price for the victims of the terrorism. Our army, we will be always grateful to the army for their efforts in that sense. So we consider it as an investment for a safer Tunisia in order to face terrorism, but also preventing them with systematic measures which respond directly to the enabling factors in order to preserve peace and also achieve some sustainable results. At legislative level, we adopted the relevant international instruments, which is the common legal framework in that particular field. We have adopted the first strategy against radicalization and terrorism, 2016-2021. The commission, which was created under the authority of the government, is an institutional reference body, which is here to gather all the efforts at national and international level in terms of counterterrorism and preventing terrorism, in terms of the themes which are included in the standards, as well as the coordination between the different state actors and non-state actors. The consultation approach by our commission is supported by the 20 members it's made of, which represents the different ministries which are involved in the prevention. In its strategy vision, we invest in prevention in order to increase the resilience capacities of the state and the civil society to this through activities on the long term with an overall approach respectful of the human rights. In such a context, a certain number of major projects have been developed with the ministries in order to implement the national strategy, which have included in a participatory way activities, educative, social, religious, and cultural activities in order to support this prevention via some programs to increase the individual and society resilience. In this context, the project is there to support the educative system and the universities by promoting the human rights, about the education to global citizenship, how to use internet. It's a project which was launched with the Ministry of Education as well as the Ministry for Higher Studies with the support of our international partners, which aims mainly to consolidate a system of positive values with the young, with the youth, and the respect of human rights, and the renouncement to violence, as well as developing a critical spirit which would contribute to reinforce the immunity of the youngsters.
In the humanitarian context, there have been various projects developed in partnership with the Ministry of Social Affairs, the Regional Council, the Youth and Sport Ministry, and we have really created a multi-sectoral dynamic on a national level. The idea is to really involve and engage all those involved, so the civil society, private sector, based on really reinforcing the implementation of the mechanisms already existing, and trying to really bring in all these different aspects in a synergy. There is a participatory and inclusive approach that we're really trying to emphasize with all the various stakeholders on both a local and a national level. We are really trying to make sure that everybody has what they need to set up their programs in the best possible way. We're looking also at prevention efforts with some really proven results, particularly in the latest context with the measures put in place in the COVID context. We had to really look at how we could continue our work and our real rooting on the ground level during the context and during the challenges that came up due to the pandemic. We were able to work within this context to actually continue our efforts and also to contribute to the efforts to distribute protective clothing, personal protection, food parcels, and support to certain populations. So we were able to really create and consolidate a local dynamic. We organised meetings in certain regional areas with the local authorities. And this has actually been an ongoing process since October 2018. We've had workshops to really create an exchange with local stakeholders and to try to really bring everybody on board when it comes to our preventing violence extremism efforts, and develop local frameworks to really try to work with those on the ground. We have developed, therefore, a network of 48 regional correspondents, and these are really reference points now for us on a local level. We have a skills building program in place at the moment, and the idea is to really try to therefore increase people's knowledge of the preventive strategies that we feel are particularly suited to the local context. This really is a joint effort. I share my responsibility with all those stakeholders that are on board with this partnership process, the different organisations and institutions, the media services involved, youth organisations. We've really been able to set up a network there for in terms of our programs, our planning, our awareness raising and coordination efforts, and also our partnership agreements. We've established these with the Tunisian Federation for Sport for All, the and some other specific organizations working on a regional level. We're trying, therefore, to really develop our knowledge of preventing violent extremism and trying to benefit from the specific studies that have been carried out to try to really inform our policies and programs on both a regional and national level, particularly in terms of our revision of our national PVE strategy. This has been ongoing since the beginning of this year. We've looked at some of the studies like the ones that Michael and Hamzala presented, and we're trying to really try to bring this experience to bear now in our work, and work therefore with the governance of the various regions, particularly linked to the border regions. We have been active on social networks, particularly during the COVID period, and we've been therefore tracking the repercussions of the economic situation and the negative impact on general feelings of insecurity within these areas. We've seen that there have been some real effects when it comes to lack of investment on an economic level. And therefore, we're looking at these studies as an entry point to really stimulate and encourage the involvement of the private sector in our PVE efforts. Particularly looking at this economic development issue, we feel that there's a lot of information that can be brought into our work now. We're developing our international partnership network as well. We want to really strengthen this now through our contacts at the United Nations, also with NGOs linked to PVE work within the Tunisian context. We have the Tarawih project on board, therefore. This has been supported by the UNDP, and the idea is to really increase our resistance and resilience, developing our work within two axes, societal support and institutional support. And so the idea is to really try to have an overall approach to this work. We've also collaborated with the European Union, and this collaboration is ongoing, particularly with projects within the PVE sector. We have coordination between different initiatives here to create a real synergy, and this support has been really valuable. We've had financial support from GSERF as well, and support from the civil society organizations and university bodies, as well as research institutions, to really increase our local capacities to prevent violent extremism, particularly within the border areas. We've been developing consortiums in partnership with the local authorities in these areas, with various activities and initiatives being carried out in terms of PVE. So with more than 12,000 beneficiaries, these programs have been particularly targeting young people and people who are unemployed, students, and those who are most vulnerable to violence and criminality. We have created, therefore, specific projects in the context of this program, and you'll be able to look at more information, if you like, via our website. We are also launching our second strategy soon, trying to really support the programs and initiatives in underprivileged regions. I'll now wrap up. I've got a few reflections just to share with you before I end in terms of the themes for this session. Firstly, the importance of really creating links between us and trying to create positive change for our target groups. It's really important to work on expanding these links at a greater level and really integrating these different initiatives together with a multi-sectoral coordination approach, even on an international level. This is one of the recommendations that was made by the annual report of the CNCT, and we therefore really want to place the emphasis on this. I'll just finish now by a little bit of reflection on the importance to really consider our responses to the current COVID crisis with the emphasis on human rights, particularly in the medium and long term, with structural factors linked to social cohesion and confidence in our associations. Thank you very much for listening today. Thank you, Madame Naila, for sharing your experience in Tunisia. I'd now like to come back to Hamza and ask him to talk to us a little bit more about the tensions between citizens and security forces along the border. Hamza, the army is often considered as a trusted institution in Tunisia with a positive role played during the revolution. So, but what is the reality? Is it a lot more nuanced than that for the border populations? Do you feel that we could improve the relationships with military personnel in these border areas? 2 or 3 ideas, please, Hamza. Yes, very briefly. It's true that the military institution does have a certain level of respect and trust in Tunisia, but it's also true that within the security context, in particularly with the border with Libya, there are some real issues here that have come up over the last few years when it comes to the security and military deployment in these areas, which is legitimate, of course. We've had to have this presence to do with the terrorist threat. But of course, these security threats within border areas and the attack on Ben Gedgen in 2016 has been a real key moment in this. The cohesion between populations and the security institutions has therefore been somewhat undermined and somewhat problematic. I think above all, it's important to really take into account the degradation of the socio-economic situation in the region. The security and military institutions are involved in this, I think, and they're having to revise their mode of deployment to a certain extent. They have more of a social presence, if you like. They've got a security role, of course, on a national level, but there's a more specific security and social cohesion dimension of the work in these border areas. I can give you a few examples when it comes to revisiting this social role of the army. The army has historically played this role, I think. We can talk about how this has been played out, perhaps in the 1960s, 1970s. The institution, the military institution, really did play quite a role in terms of access to culture and leisure activities for our populations and access to health as well. So I think it's important for us to really perhaps try to take advantage of a more peaceful context to a certain extent to really look again at this presence and how it is felt by the populations in these areas. Perhaps refocus the efforts on the social role of this personnel, particularly when it comes to healthcare access. I mean, this is very topical at the moment. Also, training for young people when it comes to a context that has worsened over previous years, over recent years. Um, Another important element here is linked to the idea of really communicating with populations when it comes to the perimeters of the buffer zones and military areas, I think it's really important to place the emphasis on communication. We've heard already the tensions that can emerge when it comes to a certain lack of understanding of these zones, and so therefore we must create a framework of working together so that we can really make sure that these measures are accepted and even supported by the populations in question. And even when it comes to putting in place restrictions, I think another experience to perhaps talk about here is the Security Council experience. We've seen that there have been agents involved on the ground, and that there are some initiatives that could perhaps be set up in other regions that could take this as a model. I think we could expand this work. I think there's a framework for dialogue here to create this real dynamic with the local populations and to try to establish these links. This is very important, I think, when it comes to mitigating these tensions and having a preventive role, perhaps a more upstream role, um, to try to think about what tensions could emerge in the future when it comes to the socio-economic situation of the region. Thank you, Hamza. I'd now like to pass the floor to Jean-Louis. Jean-Louis, we've talked already a lot about the activities that have taken place, illicit activities, a sort of grey economy between Tunisia and Libya. Could you perhaps give us some examples of links and perceptions between those involved in this kind of activity and violent extremism? Do you see threats on the Libyan side? Thank you very much. It's a very interesting question, particularly when it comes to the border region. I'm going to take a strong stance on this and say that the danger is more from our belief that there is a direct link between these two phenomena. The answer is that actually this very belief can create a problem in itself. So if we go into a bit more detail, the way I see it, the relationship between these two phenomena, these two players, are cross-border. In general. So I think we're not going to really go into great detail now. There are a lot of nuances here, but I think there are some changes that can take place when it comes to work from one territory to another. But I think in Libya at the moment, it really is a cross-border context. And I think at the moment, the link between the informal economy and smuggling and extremist violence is not as clear as all that. I think we have to be really careful when it comes to trying to establish this link, particularly when it comes to public policy. I see this link as something that develops in extreme contexts, perhaps when the state is too present, too repressive. It pushes people to create this link, in fact. You see that when there's not this kind of meddling efforts at place, there's another sort of alienation that can take place. So that's the other extreme, when there's a lack of justice and a lack of involvement of the state. So two extremes here might create this link, but I think we can't just take it as a given. I don't want to confuse the two groups, the two phenomena. When it comes to the border areas, I think the relationship between Tunisia and Libya does really draw on this trans-border trade, which is really quite significant, particularly on the Tunisian side. And I think in reality, we've got a lot more trade routes within Libya going from the center to the south. But I think when it comes to the cross-border trade, we can see that those involved can be very much operating within a positive context. Thank you very much, Jean-Louis. This was very interesting, and it takes us now into the direction of thinking about the balance between preventive measures and control and repression measures when it comes to violent extremism. Michael, what would be your top three priorities when it comes to government action to try to create a better balance between these approaches? And you've really tried to emphasize this during your presentation, I think. So I'd just like to pass the floor to you again on that point. Thank you. I'm just making sure that my microphone is working. Can you hear me again? Yes, great. Okay. So there are two dimensions here. Firstly, on a national level, there are a lot of initiatives already taking place through the National Committee to Fight Terrorism. And this committee is very open to preventive approaches. There are many stakeholders involved that understand now that the context is quite different from 2016 and things need to be revised now to actually improve the context and improve our efforts. We need to look at the way in which some of the relationships with citizens have deteriorated. There are certain things that I think can be done in terms of improving strategy, in terms of updating programs and some of our legal articles as well. Our emergency responses as well, I think, can be revised perhaps, because we've seen that there are certain measures that came in because they were justified during a real crisis context. But I think now it's a case of actually looking again at some of the social and professional contexts and how things can be perhaps updated. I think there are some individuals who've recently been released from prison as well. So we need to think about how that is being dealt with as a potential threat. So this is on a national level. There are certain things that are being developed at the moment. And then there's also the issue of the cross-border space. This is another question altogether, I think, and Hamza said a lot about this. I feel that we can take a similar position here and say that the state is in rather a dilemma, and this dilemma is going to be ongoing. I think it's something that we've always got to bear in mind. It's not something new, but establishing this balance is key. And I think the state needs to be able to use a non-security pretext to increase its presence in the border areas. And I think security is often used as a pretext to increase state presence in these border zones. And I think actually this can create a certain amount of paranoia, and this isn't necessarily positive for the relationship with locals. I think there are other ways that frameworks can be put in place in order to actually establish community management within these frontier zones, trying to actually look at communication as a key issue again. How can we really emphasize this? How can we see what initiatives could be carried out on a local level? I think these things are very important now, particularly with the COVID context at the moment. I think on a worldwide level, all these things are being questioned. We're now living in a world that continues to be globalized with various challenges on all kinds of levels, and we're not going to return to the nationalistic order of the past, if you like. I think we have to really adapt to the changes taking place and be quite intentional about this. We have to think about how our cooperative efforts could be reinforced, could be strengthened. How can we really take advantage of what exists already and be creative in our exchanges? if there are cultural initiatives taking place either side of the border, how can we draw on this? How can we really have a rebranding process when it comes to these areas? And then perhaps bring in a more political agenda. And we need state resources, of course. Thank you, Michael. Just therefore, the idea is to rethink governance on a local level. I think this is something that is going to be discussed during the revision of the national strategy to fight extremism and extremist violence. I'm going to pass the floor back to Madame Nelia. We are a little short of time, but I think you've given us an overview of how your processes are working at the moment in terms of revising your strategies. So how would you really characterize the needs of the Tunisian populations, particularly in the border regions? I pass you the floor. Are you? I think you were mute. Oh, okay, great. So just to recall the national strategy against violent extremism. This dates back to 2016. This was our first strategy to define a real action plan on a sectoral level to fight violent extremism. We're now at the end of this strategic process. 2021 was the end year for this, so we are revising the strategy now. We launched the review process at the beginning of this year in consultation with the National Security Council. So we have now really gone into this process, and so what's happened between the first and the second strategy is now being taken into account. We have a lot more experience now, having worked on this for 5 years when it comes to really capitalizing on our efforts, the experimentation that has taken place and all the exchanges between those involved. So I think this revision is really going to be able to improve things and take into account also new threats to national security, links to certain phenomena that are evolving, linked also to some of the lessons learned from the implementation of the first strategy. The methodology of our revision is firstly to create working groups within the Commission to specifically look at certain areas of this strategy. We've therefore tried to divide up the work to a certain extent. So there are a specific parts of the documentation being examined, and this work is being done based on an evaluation process of various players involved on a governmental level and also within civil society. So we're looking at the new challenges on a strategic level, and above all, what our capacities are and our potential to really be a key player within the prevention sector. So this is a process that is ongoing at the moment. It's been supported by various stakeholders. We've had open discussions with certain organizations within the civil society, representing those on the front line, if you like, in terms of prevention. The idea is to really identify, therefore, what the key challenges are and what are the strong and the weak points of our work to date. We have already looked at most of the areas identified in these discussions. The discussions have now pretty much come to an end, and we're going forward to the next step, the consultation process with young people, with the private sector, with representatives from local authorities as well, so the municipalities and the media sector as well, and civil society organizations. So the idea is to really hear from all these stakeholders and have a participative and inclusive approach to really ensure this strategy can be as good as it can be for the future. Thank you, Madame Nelia. So inclusion, participation, listening. And I'd like to thank now all the panelists for this very rich discussion that we've had today. I'm going to find it very difficult to summarize our discussion today in the short time that I have, but perhaps a few key messages. Firstly, context. The Tunisian and Libyan contexts have changed over the last few years. In Libya, we have a fragile stabilization opportunity, but an opportunity, but also economic considerations to benefit the whole region, not only Tunisia. In Tunisia, we've had a reduction of the security threat, but we have economic and social tensions linked to the pandemic. We need to take into account the complexity of these contextual specificities. This is really fundamental for preventing violent extremism. I think the local dimension of our prevention work is so important. The second message is linked to the interdependency of security priorities and social priorities. Human security reinforcement really does need to be based on these two pillars and take into account the perspectives of the populations in frontier areas. In the Tunisian context, there has been a reframing of this balance of the priorities of those living in border areas and development strategies. Also, when it comes to defining our PEV strategies within these regions. The third message to really take away today is that the state presence is really important when it comes to our efforts and when it comes to the perception of those involved. I think it's very important to consolidate this and to really reflect upon this presence. I'm going to wrap up there. I can see it's 11 already, so I'd like to thank you all. Thank you, participants. Thank you, panelists, and goodbye.